Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, welcome to Shape the System. I'm your host, Vincent Turner, and we're talking today to Manu, who is actually a former accelerator friend of mine. I don't know how to say that. Accelerator, we were in Village Capital together. And Village Capital, you may remember if you've heard some of earlier episodes, Victoria Fram was actually our first guest on the show. And she runs Village Capital, which is the accelerator that we were in together. This is in 2015?
That sounds right. I think 2014, 2015 roughly. Goes way back.
2014. Okay, cool.
Time flies when you have fun.
Well, I mean, interestingly, I guess from this is that whilst I've I moved countries and came back and started working on a different thing and then set up a podcast, you're actually still going on MPower. So we're going to, as we always do, get stuck straight into problem space and then go from there as to, how you guys are solving that problem. So let's understand a little bit about the space that MPower is playing in.
Sure. And so just saying hi to the audience, I'm Manu, the CEO and co-founder of MPower. And in a nutshell, what MPower does is we're the leaders in international student financing in the US and Canada. So tactically, it means that we finance students coming from 180 countries around the planet, going to the top 350 universities in the US and Canada. Yep. So that's the bread and butter. What we do from a mission standpoint is we remove financial barriers to higher education. So what we find is there's millions and millions of highly capable students around the planet, either going into undergrad studies or having worked a few years after an undergrad degree, looking to pursue further studies. Right. And these students are constrained by money. And oftentimes that constraint is enough to deter them from studying or even thinking about pursuing their studies. And we think that that's a shame. That's a major loss of human capital. It's a major loss of intellectual capital for them and, reaching a more fulfilling life and a life with more socioeconomic mobility. It's a loss for the universities in the US and Canada that have extra capacity, that need that global diversity. And more importantly, I think it's just a loss for society. I think these international students play huge roles as bridges between countries.
Sure.
They have huge economic impact, either in the host countries or when they go back to their home country in terms of the skills they bring back, the networks, and so on. And one thing that keeps me up at night is I always wonder, what happens if we don't finance that student that could have the cure for cancer or COVID or, that could be the next great leader of an emerging market or that could be the next head of Google or Microsoft or the next co-founder, the next founder of a Tesla-like company. So that's really what's at stake here to me.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's a few things in here I want to unpack. The first, as always, so the first one of these is the flow of students to the US. And so you made this point that they're typically already having studied overseas somewhere. So they might have been studying in India or Pakistan or any number of the 180 countries you spoke about. And then there's some need to come to the US and Canada. Now, this is because that's where you operate. It's not to suggest there's not other great universities elsewhere or even in these countries, but the model is to get them into these top 350, I think you said,
correct,
universities in Canada and the US. What's the motivation for them to take that on? Is there what's the requirement, the thing that says, well, I wouldn't be able to do what I want to do to run the company or to go and be an emerging leader in my local economy unless I go to that university? What's the motivation for them in the first place?
I think there's a few, and I would break it down between what are sort of constraints or limitations in their home country and what are the opportunities in North America. And I mentioned North America, that's where MPower is today. There's also great universities in Australia and in Europe. And so to go back to the constraints, there's limited capacity for graduate degree programs in places like India or China or Brazil in terms of top quality. And it's actually somewhat true at the undergrad level as well, where it can be a fight to the end to score among the top, X number of students and make it into IIT or picking IIT in India or picking university in China and so on. So it's pretty ruthless at the undergrad level. It's pretty limited at the grad level.
Right.
And beyond that, it's still, how to put it, very provincial. So even if you make it there for a graduate degree, assuming you can get into a top one, assuming that it's recognized and there's value in it, you're still sort of a king of a hill versus having more of a broad sort of global view and impact. So there's a lot of limitations to doing an advanced degree and to some extent even an undergrad degree in your home country. Now the appeal, beyond that, the appeal of the US and Canada and going overseas is there's more capacity at these top universities. Enrollment has declined. Domestic enrollment has declined in the US for the past several years, and the capacity is very much there and could go up. That's one advantage. The other one is a name like Harvard or the University of Toronto or others have a lot of cachet globally.
Right.
And so it sort of gives you a ticket to work around the planet in multinationals or to attract VC funding for a startup in the Silicon Valley in a way that your domestic degree may not.
Yeah. So I was going to pause on that moment for a second because I think there's this, and it's a bit of a tangent, but there is this kind of idea that in the Valley anyone can raise capital. And my observation being there for 5 years was that if you hadn't gone to the college or worked at the company like a Google or an Apple or had an exit already, it was actually incredibly hard to raise capital. So there's a huge amount of merit in what you're saying about the cachet of these universities. And in terms of the types of things that they're studying, I mean, if you go to the MPower website, there's someone who's done a software degree and another who's done a finance kind of grad program. What typically is the kind of skill set that people are trying to acquire out of these universities and colleges in North America?
So I'll break it down into a few ways. One is 80% of students, for instance, coming out of India, which is the number one market for MPower, the number two market of international students going overseas. 80% of those students go for a graduate degree and primarily in STEM, and secondarily in business. So very high earning potential, which is why you see computer science and finance. It fits exactly into that mold. For Chinese students, it's to a lesser extent, usually about 50% of them go for undergrad degrees, 50 for graduate degrees. And even though it's still high in sort of STEM or business, it's less so compared to Indian students. Sure. To some extent, it's also a reflection of the demographic that one can come from. So it's very hard to justify $100,000 investment in an undergrad degree in the U.S. in art history, unless you come from fairly privileged background, and you
doesn't fit the model.
But it's so if you're middle class, even upper middle class, actually even frankly in the 1% in India, you're still poor relative to the upper middle class in the US. If you're in that situation, you have financial pressure to get gainful employment, and so unless you're the top 1% or 0.1% of artists in your space, a safer bet is computer science, mechanical engineering, finance, and so on, where you have a higher chance of employment afterwards.
And that's probably a good segue as well, because I think you said before, like the constraint was money, right? They don't have the money to do this. And
that's right.
I think I know that's kind of a very direct, literal thing, which says it's literally just they don't have the money. But is part of this, is it just specifically if someone had $100,000 they could get to Harvard, or is it also there's a pathway to actually even be able to get into these places and to study for them? I mean, is that pathway also part of the challenge here? Because I think a lot of what MPower's doing isn't just enabling people to have the money to be able to pay for the degree, but actually work out how the hell to even make it happen. Is that part of it?
It is, and we sort of got into that by accident, right? Initially we started with a fairly narrow focus, which is, okay, these students are already admitted or enrolled in some cases. Sometimes these were international students already.
They've already bought.
Yeah. In a school in the US, and they just needed last mile financing, right? I need $20,000 for my last year, my last semester, you name it. And I can't, work with mom and dad in the home country and a bank branch, etc. It's too complicated, undoable. They already want collateral, etc. So that's how we started. But then we realized there's sort of a wide array of students at different stages. There's the people who have the capabilities, can't even fathom going overseas to study because it's just too expensive.
Right.
And by the way, there's a gender lens to this too, in that women, on top of the financial constraints, often have social expectations placed on them around it's the brightest woman in places like India may still have pressure to get married young in certain areas or in certain families. And so the idea that not only will it require money for them to, an extensive amount of money for them to study overseas, but on top of that will delay or not have a marriage occur when they're in their early 20s can be a difficult pill for certain family members to swallow.
Yeah, that's what I sort of what I was getting to, because I mean, one of the videos that's on the site talks about Sarah, I think it is, or Sarah, I'm maybe not getting her name right.
Sarah Haider, who was the first Pakistani student at Juilliard for a master's degree. She's both an actress and a singer.
Amazing. Cool little video too, and she's incredibly eloquent in how she lays all this out. And it was fascinating to watch it. But I mean, the point she made, which I think was fascinating, which is kind of what I was trying to get to, is money's kind of the thing to point at and say, well, they don't have the money. But in her example, she was talking about how even when going to the local universities in Pakistan, in her case, half of the people within the first year or so wouldn't be there after that, because these women would be married and then have to be going back into the household and give up their ambition to have any kind of career or higher education. And just part of this kind of constraint, I guess, is that, that it's giving them a pathway to be able to go and study in the US and do the full 4 years or however long it is. Fascinating insight. Just the one thing about money, though, that was interesting to me, and I think if I look on your site a fair bit, you're talking a lot about this idea of co-signer. And my guess is this is some sort of guarantee that is typically how university education is funded in the US. Is that talk a little bit about how university education is typically bought and paid for in the US today? Forgetting the international thing for a minute.
Sure. And that's really important. So the status today is when you hear sort of big headlines in the US about student lending and you unveil the curtain, it's usually a few things. One is it tends to be about federal student lending. So the Department of Education making loans to students.
Right.
And those may or may not require a cosigner. And if you go into, and that's about 75% of the market is these federal loans. The other 25% is private student loans. So the likes of Sallie Mae, Wells Fargo, Citizens Bank, etc. Those are, in reality, they're parental loans. So you're having mom and dad co-sign the loan, and it's really their credit score that matters for the great part. There's a few fintech companies. Ascent Student Loans is an interesting one in North America, trying to tackle that and create independent loans in much the same way that MPower does it for international students. So getting independence from mom and dad, not being a financial burden on the parents. But that's the way it works today. So your mom and dad are essentially co-signing your loan, and oftentimes not realizing what the true return on investment is or isn't for a junior to go study.
So what might the return for the parent, the return on investment for them, or?
For the students, that's an interesting way to see it. What is it for the students outside of, getting junior out of the house and into college?
Some peace and quiet, finally. So this idea of a co-signer, I think it's a US term, so I just want to de-US it just for a minute. It's essentially a guarantee, right? It's someone saying, well, you don't have a credit score, you don't have an income, you're about to borrow $100,000 to do a 3-year degree. Is that about an order of magnitude here? For do a 3 or 4 year grad degree?
for an undergrad degree in the US, you're definitely looking at about $100,000 for 4 years, so $25K a year, and that can actually be in certain cases on the low end. Granted, a lot of American students have access to, some federal aid, so not just loans, but also grants or tuition discounts.
Yeah.
For graduate degrees, you're looking at 100 and 150K plus for an MBA. And we advertise this at MPower. There's a lot of schools that are still top 200, top 100, top 50 that fly a bit under the radar and that offer, in some cases, a 2-year master's degree for maybe 25K in tuition.
Got it.
So there's ways to, on the ROI calculation, you can optimize for, the return and a really high salary afterwards, but it's also important to optimize for the I, right? For the investments. And so how do you lower the cost of your education?
Yeah, look, I guess the thing that I'm sort of getting to here is this idea that if the bank of mum and dad is what's ultimately enabling junior in whatever capacity to go to university, and then going to that university, getting higher education, going into more high-paying jobs, I mean, it's just entrenching a generational wealth thing, and I feel like you've talked a bit earlier on about people's potential, right? You want to have the person who builds the next Tesla or cures the cancer or runs the country. But also there's a systemic challenge that's happening here that's playing out because the only people who get to go to university are the people whose families are already wealthy.
That's right.
And I can sort of relate this a little bit back to I didn't finish university, and my mother honestly still brings it up like 25 years later. She was in. She's not even like of an ethnic background where that's like a given. Apparently, that if you were of some ethnicity and you don't finish university, you're a failure to the entire family. But she was a doctor, or a psychiatrist actually, but in the public practice, and they couldn't keep doctors in the public practice because they'd all go off to private and make 3 times as much money.
Yeah.
But my mum and dad both operate in the public practice, but the way that they kept them in public practice was to give them tax breaks, and one of those tax breaks was to pay for their kids' education. They could pay it out of tax-free money. And I get the idea, right? They wanted to keep bright people in the public service, and it obviously was helpful. But it meant that my ability to go to university was not only did the government give them a tax break, but the university provided a discount because they could pay up front. Like the cost of my ability to go to the degree that I never finished versus someone else who didn't have either of those advantages. I never felt, I didn't feel guilty at the time about it, but I mean, it's amazing how rigged that system is against someone who's doing it. And probably a good segue from here. So, if it's not assets and not their current ability to pay the money, then like, how are you approaching? How are you giving people loans? Like on what basis are you working out who to give someone a loan and what risk they are and whether they'll pay it back?
Yeah, great question. Like you said, the traditional model of brick and mortar banks is you look at how much wealth mom and dad have,
right,
and how much real estate. And we joke that oftentimes the bank branch manager will send a guy with a stern look and a mean mustache over to your home and try to appraise it, take some notes, and in a black box process you might end up with a partial loan in rupees or reais or rubles, you name it.
Right.
And so, and to your point, what that does is it sustains this inequality, right? It's if you're not super wealthy, you don't have that land and the extra real estate, or even if you do and you don't want to put that burden on mom and dad, like how do you do it? So we focus on future potential for the students. We're like, hey, these students are not thin file, right? Like there's actually quite a lot of data around them. It's just not data in the way that traditional banks think about it. It's not, an established credit history and tons of collateral that they can use. What it is the academic information, like what has been their academic performance, where are they headed, what type of university, what type of degree, what are their chances of succeeding in that and landing a job with, high earning enough that they can pay back the loan.
Right.
And then on top of that, what we find is there's a lot of correlation also with that the discipline it takes to get into an overseas program and succeed there is also highly correlated to financial discipline and behavior.
Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you in order to even get the visa to come to the US or Canada, you have to it's such, I'm sure you've gone through it. It's such a grueling experience. Like, you better have all your paper, or you're not missing deadlines at that point.
Yeah. You're organized. Well, just as another segue on this, when I came to the US in 2010, if you remember kind of the timing of the GFC or whatever, it was literally the best time to come to America and say, hi, I'd like to start a job, bring money and employ Americans and pay taxes. And I ended up having an interview at the US consulate back in Perth. And it was a 3-minute interview. And they were like, oh, it's all good. Please come. I couldn't have picked a better time for me personally on that. That was kind of lucky. But yeah, I mean, you get hauled over the coals for this stuff. And so hold on, are you looking at their academic transcripts in the country that they've already gone through some form of education, whatever that is? Are you assessing other parameters there in terms of their financial kind of, just not their wealth, but their financial diligence in terms of they pay their bills there? Like, what are you actually looking at? What are you observing on the current state?
Sure. So we look at financial information, home country, anything that gives us data around behavior.
Right.
We're looking at test scores and sort of aptitude in their existing degrees. Oftentimes, like I said, we're doing last mile financing. So how is their academic performance in the US or Canada in their current program? And then, what we also look at is, financial data. There's a big difference between someone needing to borrow $100,000 for a degree and someone who's got, say, an $80,000 scholarship,
right?
Or some parental savings, some personal savings, some scholarships, and needs money for essentially the difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that last mile thing that you're talking about, this is where someone has got 3 years into a 4-year degree and have, for whatever reason, they thought it would be 80,000 and it was actually 100. And it's the worst thing in the world is a 90% finished project, right? You did all the work and you're almost at the finish line. And is that it sounded like that's where you started, and now you've actually worked out how to get someone into the entire degree. Has that sort of been the evolution of MPower then?
We did both, and we find that it evolves over time. Certainly, with COVID has created more demand for digital lending, right? You don't want to physically bring mom and dad to a bank branch. In addition to the paperwork and the usual hassle, now on top of that, you're taking health risks for your elderly parents. So it's created more demand for digital lending. And it's also created financial stress for a lot of families. Whether that has translated into mom and dad have less money to invest in your education, or you don't want at this point in time to be a burden on top of everything else to mom and dad, or you're unsure about the future, that's created more need for MPower to both sort of plug a gap in the junior, senior year of undergrad or in their last year of grad school, or to help finance the entire thing. And we do both. For a variety of reasons. Some students do 2 years of community college in the US to lower sort of the costs for those first 2 years, and then they transfer to a 4-year school, and it's a big ticket item. It's a big change in price, and so a bit of a financial shock. They need money. Or sometimes, students come from wealthier families. Mom's a doctor, dad is a lawyer. I'm just stereotyping, but one of them loses their job, right? Or dad's a corporate in a big corporation and loses the job, where the family business is not doing as well during COVID, and they need additional money.
Got it.
So those are the scenarios that happen.
And just sort of to complete the picture of how, I mean, you've worked out or have some, like, I'm guessing it's continuing to evolve, but some thing that is helping to understand the potential of these people measured in ultimately in income, right? Because you have to get the loan paid back. So I've got 2 questions, probably quite separable, but maybe they're connected. One is I'm interested in the relationship that you have with the universities, and like, how is it quite arm's length, or are you in close quarters with what they're trying to do and the types of people they're trying to bring, and even some of the diversity that they're trying to create that you mentioned earlier? And the second thing I'm trying to understand is where's the funds coming from that you're putting into the loans? Because you may have created an algorithm, but someone else who's an investor in those loans has to buy the story. And I'm curious as to where those investment funds are coming from.
Sure. It's sort of the relationship to the universities, and then the relationship to the money. So
funders.
Or the funders. So the relationship to the university, what we realize is we're very much a B2B2C type company, where the universities need our product, right? And it's sort of symbiotic.
Right.
We want to keep neutrality with respect to the schools and the students. So we don't want to, we don't get commissions for universities unless the students haven't chosen a university yet. And then we try to help them make the best choice for them.
Right.
And again, we try to do that independent of any, any money from any school. But that's the only scenario. Otherwise, it's purely we fund students there. The university can help the students find access to different funders. And usually we're the only option or one of the very few options for international students. Right. So it's more of a channel partnership with the schools. Although we do, and this is the value we bring to the universities, not only do we bring them more students, but we bring them socioeconomic diversity. So instead of having, all students coming from the top 0.1% of society in China or Europe, we're able to sort of like take students from different socioeconomic tranches. And then geographic diversity. We have a strong representation of students coming from sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, India, and elsewhere that would be less represented in US and Canadian universities.
This might be a terrible, like an ill-informed or under-informed or even ignorant question, but why is that important to universities? Like, what are they trying to solve for, or what does it solve for them?
I think for if you're in charge of a university and you really care about your job as dean of admissions or as university president, I would think that you would want a diverse set of students because everyone benefits from that diversity. You're in the education space. If you have if 100 out of 100 students are white males from North America and the same income band,
balding.
You have 100 Vincents, you'll have a lot of fun. But, will you have as many?
Anyone's having fun if there's 100 of us.
But that's the value, I think, is the different viewpoints. You learn so much in class, but you learn so much outside the classroom. And if you're able to have someone, some of these students may never have met someone from Kenya or from Chile before, and so that's where some of that value comes from.
Yeah.
And then you asked me the relationship to the funders or the money. I think at this point, we have 7 years worth of data on top of other sort of proxy data that we've captured. We bought some data. We got data from public sources and so on. So at this point, the value of what we bring to the table in terms of performance and why we get this performance is pretty established.
Right.
And that's why we were able to bring Goldman Sachs to the table as a partner. From the student perspective, it's an MPower loan through and through.
Yeah.
So, we, even when we have funders, we're still servicing, we're still the front end, we still manage everything. So it's, if the students don't have to worry about who's holding my loan. Will I still have, MPower give me a break if I need more time to get a job, or will MPower help me with immigration issues? And we do all that. We actually have an immigration consultant from Canada on staff. We have immigration lawyers we work with that work for free for the initial sessions just to orient the students on certain things.
Yeah, I love it. I just coming back one step on that, because I was going to ask you how much data you have, and I figured it was at least 5 years because that's when we were hanging out, or 6 years. Hold on, we're coming into 2021, 7 years. So it is 7 years. Okay. Was it formed in 2014 or was it just before that? Yeah. Okay. So you literally just formed when we hung out.
And then we joined the fund. Yeah. You're there at the very beginning.
And Mike had a lot of hair then, but he's got a lot of hair now, by the way. Sorry to come back to hair, but Mike's out of control. I love it. It's just so much going on up there.
That's right.
This is Manu's co-founder, by the way. Or he's co-founder. Is that the right terminology? Yeah.
Yeah, co-founder. He jokes that he's Persian, so he jokes that he just goes like this, blows his nose.
It is like, we'll put a link to it somewhere, because I actually got onto the About Us page of the site to just check in and see how that mop was going, and he's not lost a cent. It's grayer, but that's all.
It's funny.
The thing I was going to say was, with 7 years of data, not only have you got a real sense of the financial impact, but you're starting to see the behavior of these people who finished the last mile, gone into the job, gone back to the country. Is that something that's have you got, I'd love to hear maybe one or two kind of representative stories of a couple of people you're like, this is exactly in the pocket of what someone who's come through has gone on to do, and probably the thing that keeps motivating you and the team, I'm guessing.
Sure. There's some pretty inspiring stories. So one thing that's interesting is, and we didn't expect that going in. We make loans such that they're sustainable globally, so that we're not, marrying the student to staying in North America or going back.
Right.
But what we found is in 87% of the cases, so 87% of the students we lent money to, 4 years later, they're still in North America.
Right.
4 years after graduating, they're still in North America.
Got it.
So that's been interesting, and they're covering all walks of life. I mean, we had a student that jumps out. She secured a job at Facebook, and her first year, this is out of undergrad from a very good engineering school in the US, was making, this is 2-3 years ago, was making $120,000 a year out of undergrad. It made me rethink my life choices.
Anyone working at Facebook's making you rethink your life choices, actually. I was going to say, I think Facebook got a bargain if they're only paying that much for like Valley talent, like working in the Valley. Yeah. And she's still at Facebook, or has moved on elsewhere? Or?
I don't know. I mean, we don't stock. We have thousands and thousands of these bars, so we don't stock their LinkedIn profiles. But we do try to stay in touch. We provide a discount when students graduate and they show us proof of employment. We give a discount on the loan, so that allows us to stay in touch.
Right.
And we've had a few testimonials of students who've paid off their loan also and are working in various jobs. A lot of times it's in tech, it's in finance, it's in big corporations. We have a lot of students in the health space. So a lot of students who are doctors or dentists or specialized. So they need money for a fellowship, for instance.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, we have a few students who go back to the home country. Oftentimes they go back to an emerging market. And so either they're working and setting their own consultancy, for instance, or they're working for a multinational in the home country.
Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded, one of the people we interviewed quite early in the show, the start of the show, was Mark Karaki, who was in the Valley doing, I think he was in a business development role at Oracle or something like that. And he'd originally come out on a soccer/football scholarship, depending on what country you're in.
Those are great. Yeah.
And that allowed him to study, and then allowed him to ultimately graduate with some degree. And he's ultimately gone back to Africa and set up basically a startup studio where he's now, helping other startups set up. And like, he just saw that opportunity to take that whole set of skills and opportunity that he had. And it feels like a microcosm of like what's obviously already happening with MPower. But I'm guessing, if you say, have you got thousands of students, you're inevitably going to see a flow back. Even 13% of thousands of students is a lot of people going back with a whole new, probably not just a set of skills or even financial capability, but an outlook on their ability to operate in their own market and to operate differently. I'm guessing it changes who they are.
It does. I think it changes who they are. It creates, so they're going back with a network. To your point, they're going back with a mindset.
Right.
I think more frankly, and I don't know how many nations are realizing it. I think Australia and Canada are probably at the forefront of realizing that international student education is not an import. You import people, but you're exporting your higher education. But beyond that, you're exporting your ideas and your way of business and your network. Right. And so what you're doing is when you're educating an international student, they benefit, your schools benefit, etc. But also you've created a lifelong ally, right? Assuming they had a decent time in Australia, the UK, or even if they did it, at the very least, you'd hope that they have a better understanding of some of the values in the country and why certain things are the way they are. And so when they go back home, they have a different mindset, to your point, but they also they're probably an ally for your country, an ambassador locally.
Yeah.
And so if you want to create more understanding on the planet, if you want to, sort of build more bridges between countries, I think international students, and there's 5 million of them today around the planet, are key to that. How do you encourage more of these exchanges? Is the question, I guess.
And without being Norway, who apparently give their students or their young, people who've exited school, ability to take a year off and go to another country for a year. That's why there's Norwegians everywhere. I don't know if that's true or not, so hopefully someone can validate that for me. So, look, 6-7 years in, thousands of people coming through it. The models, I think in terms of lending terms, they call the book seasoned enough so that people can see the performance of how the loans go. So there's an ability to attract capital. What's holding you guys back at the moment? Like, what's the thing you're hitting up against now in terms of working out how to 5x this or 10x this? I'm assuming that the opportunity's there. So
absolutely.
What's the barrier?
So Historically, we've grown 2 to 3x every single year. And the biggest challenge is, so there's two. There's one that we no longer have, and then there's one I'll explain we'll still have for a little bit. The one we no longer have as much is the capital constraints.
Right.
So because we didn't have as much data, I joke that my job as a CEO stood for Chief Extraction Officer. I was always fundraising. Equity, loan capital.
That is always the job.
yeah. So it was never ending and the more successful we were, the faster we were growing, the more money we needed to lend.
Right.
And so that was a constraint because people always think like, what is the point at which like that's it? Folks start believing your story and your data and they invest. And the reality is it's a spectrum. We had one guy cut us a $25,000 check when we were just two dudes on a website. And then even today, there's still some groups, even though the Goldman invested, 2 years ago and several others have since, there's, still some groups that'll say, well, I don't know, I need to see X, Y, Z. And so it's all on the spectrum, but we're now at a place where, for the majority of even institutional groups we speak with, like they get to a comfortable place fairly quickly.
Right.
What the new constraint now is awareness building. Right. And what we realize and what's, I think, uniquely challenging for MPower is we have to establish awareness and digital trust around the planet. Like, why would someone sitting, say, in Thailand or in Argentina or what have you, like, have trust in this website called MPower to borrow $20 or $30 or $50,000 for their education? And oftentimes the parents in places like India, the parents are involved in that financial decision as well. And so how do you make them aware that MPower exists and that, they shouldn't go to, their corner bank branch with mom and dad and take a horrendous interest rate loan and this difficult process and so on. And instead get a loan in US dollars dispersed directly to the university. So how do you build that awareness that we exist as an option?
Yeah.
And the second one is once they're aware of it, how do you establish trust when you're thousands of miles away and you don't have an existing relationship?
Right.
And so, this is where, local partners come into play. This is where, clearly explaining upfront the value add that we have, why we're cheaper, why we build their credit in the US and Canada, why we help with immigration or with job placement, why there's even tax advantages if they continue working in the US after graduation, right? You can deduct some of the interests from your income taxes, for instance. And so there's all sorts of advantages, but it requires sort of building a relationship. And so we have, people available on the phone via chat on our website. We have testimonials. We have alumni, quote unquote, MPower alumni speaking, but it is, I think it's an interesting challenge and one that'll probably keep us awake for the next few years.
Yeah, because when you sort of said you got two challenges, one of them we've solved and one of them we're on the verge of solving, I was thinking like there was sorry, a moth just landed on me. That's what's
Where do you
doing
live?
the podcast.
What the hell?
I'm in the Blue Mountains, but it's 9:30 at night, and so I'm the only room with a light on.
That's funny.
Anyway, maybe we'll edit that out.
I forget this is Australia. They're like
probably
all sorts of creatures.
One of my friends up here had found a snake skin in the driveway,
that's
which
nice.
is not what you really want when you're leaving the house with your 2-year-old under your arm. There's a snake skin, and it has a next door neighbor who brings over funnel web spiders when he finds them in his house. It's scary. I'm like, dude, please stop doing that. It's not helping. Yeah, so I guess it sounded like you were cracking the nut on that a little bit. So it was, I mean, that thing is probably a spectrum as well, right? The ability to create trust over distance. I mean, I think there was that wonderful definition of trust is doing lots of small things consistently over time. Kind of that's the formula, and that's, you can't build trust quickly and you can't build trust by just saying, trust me. So I think you're right. I think that'll be something you're doing for a while. I guess one of the questions I had on that specifically was, it feels to me like you're building a community of people around you, of people who've gone through, that you've helped and have ultimately been successful. Do you see community playing a role in that, in terms of building a community around MPower? Because these people are obviously end up having networks and have other people who, might be like them and might need what they needed.
A little bit. And I think there's different different people have different willingness around levels of involvement. To some students, we're a lender, right? And that's what we are. So, it's just like, I don't want to speak with you guys too many times. Like, I'm happy just making my payments monthly, et cetera.
Yeah.
So,
right.
and I understand that. And then, but to others, it's like, we're life changers. They really believe in the mission, et cetera. And so they volunteer to, for instance, talk to students or help students find a job. So, for instance, we might say we have 12 students currently who are MPower borrowers who are attending the same program you attended. And like
right.
you, they want to go into finance or into tech or into a health field. Would you be open to having a webinar with them or, sharing this? And some people are like, sorry, dude, I just had a kid or I have too much work or no time or no interest. But a surprisingly large number of students are like, you know what? Like, I want to make a difference for international students like me who go through this. Or I connect me with someone from my country or my city, right? Because I share that cultural linkage with them.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. And I think as we grow, we'll probably find ways to make more of those connections.
Yeah, and it sort of takes me to like trying to understand how you arrived in this moment, working in this space and solving this problem. Like, what's the backstory that saw you and Mike setting up in a garage somewhere and convincing someone to give you $25,000?
Yeah, the writing's been on the wall for me, I think, a while back. So 22 plus years ago, I was myself an international student from France to the US.
Right.
Frankly, Vince and I did okay academically, but struggled financially through school, took a bunch of odd jobs, ultimately graduated with the help of my family. But it was a lot of financial stress on my family. It was a lot of financial stress for me. And I wondered, why aren't banks lending to international students? Why is it so hard? And if it's this hard for me coming from a middle class family in Western Europe, how much harder had it been if I was coming from an emerging market or an even lesser fortunate family? And so that planted a seed in my head, and I got the chance to, work in consumer finance in the US and management consulting and tech, et cetera. But in my personal life, this issue kept repeating itself. So I financed my little sister when she came to the US. I saw countless friends sort of drop out of school. And in late 2013, there was a student at my alma mater at UVA who reached out to me. And long story short, he was about to drop out of school for $500. He couldn't he couldn't pay his rent. He was going to get evicted, and he's like, you know what, maybe I should just drop out of school. And I thought, this is nuts. Why is this happening 15 years after I've, experienced something similar?
Right.
Why are we letting down what is essentially a poster child of who we should keep in school? He was doing well academically. He was the first in his family to go to college. He was a mechanical engineer.
Is this an international student as well, or was it just a student generally?
Yeah, Mexican-American students. And it just sort of shocked me. I thought, if it's happening to him today, how many more in this situation? How many more would come if money were not a barrier?
Right.
There's one who's by all standards has already succeeded. He's already there. He's already completing the degree, and even then, it's still a hurdle. So how much more of a hurdle is it for people who are not even thinking about coming here? So that I couldn't get that out of my mind. I sent him the money. I said, pay it forward, but it stuck with me. And it stuck enough that I was like, I need to do something about this. And that was the birth of MPower. And my co-founder, Mike, even more interesting story. He's the son of refugees from political refugees from Iran who immigrated to the US.
Right.
So his dad was about to get assassinated literally during the Iranian Revolution. His dad was the dean of a university. So like all intellectuals, his head was at stake. So we joked that in 45 minutes, they left the country with whatever they could grab, jumped on a plane. Like a lot of political refugees, or refugees in general, did a lot of country hopping before being granted access to the US. When they got to the US, they didn't have much money. So my co-founder Mike grew up on welfare. Being the son of a university academic, education was quite central. So to him and his upbringing. So at age 14, he actually got into university at Purdue.
At age 14?
At age 14, yeah. It's a family of geniuses that they have. I told you it was a much better story than mine. And so, but what it did is, not only were they not financially fortunate, but the fact that he got into university early actually compounded the problem. There's less years for saving.
Right.
And so how do you pay for Purdue education at that time? And so they put it together. Purdue University was great in helping him out. His mom took additional jobs and so on. And so they figured out how to get him through. And I think, to this day, he's very thankful that he had this opportunity, because he is where he is today. And, then later he worked at a tech company, launched 13 plus companies, went to INSEAD, co-founded MPower with me, and so on, still on the board of MPower. So, but education was that one tool that allowed him to get where he is today.
Yeah.
So, so that's his story. And this is why we're passionate about this. I think it changed our lives, both for Mike and myself.
Oh, and I'm curious, what did Mike actually study, by the way?
Mike was a computer engineer. He had two majors. So it was computer engineering, and I'm ashamed I don't remember his other major. And they had three minors. He had Spanish and two other ones. He had.
I was so hoping you would say art history. That's where I was going with that. I wanted to come full circle on some art history somewhere in there.
I think his dad would have probably murdered him.
We'll have Mike on later for a check-in. Manu, that was awesome. I knew that there was a wonderful story in here, and I'm so glad we got to tell all of it. But I'm really, really excited for everything that you guys have achieved 6 or 7 years since you and I were in Accelerator together, and I think it's fascinating, and I guess I think about the idea that you're bringing, students, international students into the US and Canada, and the amount of economic opportunity that's creating for them and for people everywhere. And I'm also excited, I think, that you've potentially worked out that this type of model can work generally. And, there's ultimately a huge amount of room to grow for you and I guess for the idea generally that, rewarding people on merit and future capability rather than where they've come from, where they're going, I think is it's fascinating and super inspiring. So thank you for telling the story, and thank you for being on Shape the System today.
Thanks for having me, man. Good connecting.
Absolutely.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.